one that I universal, right? So what we will be doing is we are going to understand the basic ways by which you can observe the human body. So these basic perspectives or ways are called as planes. Now in front of you is a box. Now let us say in what ways we can try to divide the box, right? So one way is we divide it along the red lines. Now imagine your body being divided along these lines, not literally dividing, it's an imaginary plane. So this is called the coronal plane. What are the other ways that you can divide the body? You can divide the body from, so if this is the direction, right? So this is north, south, west, east. So this was the west east way, right? Now let's try to divide them north south. Okay, so if you divide them north south, any plane that you draw north south like this would be a sagittal plane. Okay, now if this sagittal plane occurs in the mid of the body, you'll say it's mid sagittal plane. And obviously last but one of the very important ones, you can try to divide it from the very mid, right? Now if you are able to do that, this is called a transverse plane. So very often you'll use terms to you'll use sections to represent what way you're looking at things. Now I want you to look at these pictures. These pictures have been picked from I think anatomy books, and I want you to make sense of, okay, the pictures have been linked. Anyways, now if you look at this picture, right, you're seeing it from the front, right? You can identify the basic that this is the lungs, right? This is the liver, right? So you're seeing it from the front, right? And I hope you can come up with an answer that which plane you're observing it in. So this is a coronal view of the body, right? Now this is a picture you'd come by when you're talking about, when you're talking MRIs and stuff. You see multiple images of the brain that never looks like a brain, right? So you're looking at things from the top, right? You're looking at things from the top, and this could be a transverse plane, right? So transverse tops, the coronal, let me write, the coronal is front. Now I'm using the term just to make it familiar to you. So when you say coronal plane, you're looking from front or back. When you say transverse plane, you're looking from top or bottom. And when you say that you have got a sagittal or mid sagittal plane, that is MS, you're looking from the side. So okay, so mid sagittal side, transverse tops, coronal fronts. Okay, so try to remember this. Now many times you'll use positional terms to understand where things are in your body. So anterior or posterior, anterior towards the front end, posterior is towards the back end. Superior is the head end, inferior is the toes end. Medial or lateral, medial means towards the MS plane, that is mid sagittal plane. Lateral means away from it. Okay, proximal or distal, proximal once again towards the head and distal towards the toes. Okay, so you'll often use these terms. Now we have to understand another big stuff, that is body cavities and membranes. So these body cavities are nothing but enclosed spaces, right? And within these enclosed spaces are your organs that lie. Now generally we divide or basically group the body cavities into two categories, that is the posterior aspect and the ventral aspect or the ventral cavity. Some people also refer the posterior aspect as to dorsal cavity, but you can simply call them that. Now, the two main regions that you will find in the dorsal cavity or the posterior aspect are the cranial cavity. Now, the name itself is giving it out. What does it mean? This is a cavity that is the bony part, and it captures or it protects your brain. And the other is the vertebral cavity. Now, the vertebral cavity once again is formed by the vertebral column, which is largely made up of vertebrae, and they house your spinal cord. So the dorsal cavity largely protects your nervous system, the central nervous system, as cranial cavity and vertebral cavity. Something that is very important for here to be pointed out, that this cranial and vertebral cavities, they are not lined by uh, serous membranes, right? So it's very important distinction between the posterior aspect of the cavities and the ventral aspect cavities, or simply the ventral cavities, that the ventral cavities, they are lined by serous membranes, and we'll deal with serous membranes in lot more detail what exactly they are. But posterior cavities or the dorsal cavity is just the bony part. So this is the cranial cavity, and if you zoom into this picture, so these blue things are your vertebrae. And if you remember your younger classes, then you'd remember that these things in between the vertebrae, they are the cartilaginous intervertebral discs, which allow the movement to run very smoothly. Okay, so this was the posterior aspect or the dorsal cavity. Now let's move on to the ventral aspect or the ventral cavity. But before that, we are going to talk about the serous membranes, because it's very important. Now, what is a serous membrane? To understand a serous membrane and how exactly they function, imagine a balloon. So this is a balloon, and imagine this balloon is filled with water, right? Now this is an object which I want to protect, let's say my heart, right? Now plunge this heart into this cavity, into this balloon. So what will happen is you form a cavity around the heart, right? And in between there is this space filled with fluid. So this membrane right here is what you are going to call as a serous membrane, and it has two layers or two sides. There is a parietal membrane and there is a visceral membrane. Visceral, that means it is going to face the viscera or the organ. And in between the parietal and the visceral layer, you have this fluid, that fills this space. This cavity between those layers is the serous cavity, and this serous cavity is generally filled with serous fluid. Now, I want to point out a few things here, that this serous membrane and this and this serous cavity, this serous fluid, they get different names when you're talking about different serous membranes covering different organs. For example, if we were talking about the layer that covers the heart, then we'll say, well, this is the pericardium. Peri, that means around, cardium means heart. And the cavity in between the pericardial membranes would be simply known as the pericardial cavity, right? And don't worry, we'll go into the details of these, but another example of this is perhaps the pleura. Pleura is the double layered serous membrane around lungs, right? And in between the cavity, in between those membranes, the parietal and the visceral will have the pleural cavity, right? So what is a serous membrane? It is nothing but a membrane. That means it will be made up of cells, epithelial cells. Now remember, I hope you do remember from the epithelial lectures, that the serous membranes, they are made up of epithelium, and this epithelial gets a special name called mesothelium. So if you remember, we gave a special name to the epithelium of the blood vessels. We call them endothelium, and we gave a special name to the uh, epithelium of the serous membrane, and that's mesothelium. Okay, now what we're gonna do is we're gonna understand the various ventral cavities that we have. So this diagram gives you a rough idea. Actually, this one gives you a rough idea. So in here you have the diaphragm, right? The muscular rack-like structure that separates your ventral part. Now ventral means towards the heart side, towards the mouth side actually, right? So this is the ventral part, and this is the dorsal part, right? So the dorsal cavities, the cranial and the vertebral, are towards the back. The ventral ones are towards the front. They are divided into two parts, the first and the second. The first and the higher part is called the thoracic cavity. Now, the cavities are named according to the bones or the organs that they have. So thoracic, chest, they generally have the lungs, right? And this second is abdominopelvic cavity. Now you can understand that it's a mixture of two terms. That means there are two cavities here, and obviously there is the abdominal cavity and there is the pelvic cavity, right? So the three major cavities here is thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic. Let us zoom in further. So we understood that this is the thoracic cavity, and the thoracic cavity has the pleural cavities, the ones that harbor your lungs, right? And just above and underneath this particular region that you see is called as mediastinum, for the reason that it's between, right? And this whole region is mediastinum, and in between the pleural cavities, this one is the pericardial cavity. That means this is the one that is going to house our little heart, right? And this is abdominal, like we just did before, and this is pelvic, right? This is going to house our pelvic organs. The abdominal cavity is going to have most of our digestive organs. That includes the liver, the large intestine, the small intestine, and also this will have the kidneys and the ureter, right, of the urinary system. Okay, the pelvic cavity will have the distal part, proximal distal, I hope you remember. So the distal part of the large intestine, right? Distal part of the large intestine, that would be there in the pelvic cavity, and obviously the internal reproductive organs would also be here, right here. Okay, now what is the membrane? Like we talked about the pleural membrane, we talked about the pericardial membrane. What is the membrane, the serous membrane of the abdominopelvic cavity? The membrane of the abdominopelvic cavity is called as SERO, serous membrane. Okay, yeah, sorry, sometimes I get confused myself. That's called peritoneum. So this is the word that you would hear time and again, and I don't want you to be confused. Now, whenever you would hear peritoneum, you talk about the parietal peritoneum and visceral peritoneum. And remember the same logic. The visceral would be the layer that would be facing the organ, and the parietal would be the outer layer. Okay, and in between there's peritoneal cavity. In between them, peritoneal cavity, which would be filled with fluid, and it will allow smooth movements and reduce pressure upon each other and stuffs like that. Okay, so I think this is where we are bound to end our discussion of body cavities. To give you a gist of what we were talking about today, so we talked about how we can divide our body into several planes. We talked about the coronal plane, we talked about the transverse, and then the mid sagittal plane. Then we talked about the serous membrane, we talked about the body cavities. Now, there's one more thing that needs to be talked about. Is the serous membrane the only membrane that's there? No. We'll talk about the mucous membrane, we'll talk about synovial membrane, right? So there are actually 4 such membranes that we need to talk about. We'll be incorporating them when and such the discussions regarding them will show up. Okay, so right now we are wrapping this session up, and I hope this was educational for you and you could understand and try to relate all of these with your already existing knowledge. So guys, moving on, we'll start with the next sections of human anatomy and physiology. We'll start with the various organ systems of the body one by one, and we'll try to be faster. There will be detailed discussions. Make sure that you like and share these videos with your friends, and obviously subscribe to the channel, because the more you subscribe and make the channel big, the more efforts we can pull towards this. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye bye.